Had to pray again. Sometimes, like worship, you just get too hyped up, and you just need a moment to process what God's saying, and I just need that sometimes. So thanks for bearing with me. This morning, like I said, we're going to be in Mark chapter 4, and for those of you who were with us last week or listening last week, you're like, we were in Mark last week, and that's amazing. We're back in Mark this week. And I love this series that we've been in the past few weeks as we were praying towards this week. I didn't know if we were going to be back in this series, if we were going to go somewhere else, or what God was going to do. And I was praying towards this moment, and I was asking God just to speak. And I'll be honest, this message was not on the radar for me. I had no idea we were headed here this morning. And as I was praying and seeking God, where I thought I was going is like, nope, we're not doing that. And then I had a conversation with somebody yesterday, and I went to that verse, and that wasn't it. But through all that path, he led me to this place. And this morning, we're going to be back in that same series, Questions. And the last few weeks, we've been talking about questions that either Jesus asked somebody, like his disciples or the crowd, or somebody asked of Jesus. And this morning, we're going to be back in that series with a very relevant question for us this morning in Mark chapter 4. And if you've not been around for very long, the Mark is a gospel, right? It's this narrative story of Jesus' life as told from the perspective of Mark. And if you know the disciples, you're like listing them off in your head, and you're like, who was Mark, right? Like, where was he at? Because Mark was not a disciple, like we talked about last week. Mark actually come along a little bit later, kind of into faith in Jesus, but he was a close friend and a co-worker with a man named Peter. Now, if you know the disciples' names, Peter was one of those guys. And this morning, this gospel is the gospel of Mark as told by Peter. In other words, this is the eyewitness account today of Peter. Peter would have told these stories over and over and over again to Mark. You would have heard him teach about the life of Jesus and the miracles of Jesus. And Mark wrote that down and preserved it for us. And maybe you're listening today, you're like, why is that even important? And the reason that's important is it brings enormous credibility to the word this morning. This is not some word written hundreds of years after the death and the burial and the resurrection of Jesus, but an eyewitness account of a man named Peter written down by a man named Mark. And I love that today. And I'm so thankful today that we can trust in this word. So this morning we're going to be in Mark chapter 4. And if you look at the beginning of Mark chapter 4, you see that Jesus is teaching. It says, again, he began to teach by the sea, and a very large crowd gathered around him. So here's the scene, maybe it's setting the table this morning. Jesus is come to this place, and he's by the sea, probably out kind of in the wilderness, and he begins to teach because people start showing up. I don't know if you've ever noticed this or not, but if Jesus shows up somewhere, people always show up somewhere. Jesus actually is a very popular guy. When Jesus would show up in a town or even in the wilderness, people would leave other towns and they would come to see this guy because Jesus was an amazing man who could do things that they've never seen before. It says in the scripture that nobody had ever taught like Jesus had taught. That's people saying that about him. Some people came to hear Jesus teach, and Jesus could heal people that have maybe never walked before. He could look at them. They've been lame their whole life. They've never walked, and he could look at them and he could say, hey, get up off your mat and let's walk, and they would do that. Jesus could touch people's eyes that have never seen before, and they would be opened. He could actually speak into graves and people that had already died. Jesus could call them out. He interrupted so many funerals, and even he could take very few fish and pieces of bread, and he could multiply that to feed thousands of people with leftovers. Jesus was always doing miracles, and he was doing amazing things. And when Jesus would show up, people would show up for whatever reason. Maybe they wanted to hear him teach. Maybe they wanted to be healed. Maybe they wanted to see somebody be healed. Maybe they wanted to be fed. It didn't really matter what the reason is. People would always show up to see Jesus. And I love that truth today, because here's the reality for us in the church, and here's maybe what we have to examine today. If people aren't showing up to see Jesus, maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe what we're offering is programs and things and some fancy show, and what people need today is Jesus. And if we offer Jesus, people will show up because Jesus does amazing things, because he's an amazing person. He's God in human flesh, and people want to see that. And it's amazing. Every time Jesus shows up, he does that. And here's the story in Mark 4 where Jesus shows up, and he's out in the wilderness by the Sea of Galilee, and people start showing up, and Jesus does what Jesus often does. He begins to teach. The amazing thing is there were so many people that day that came, all those people couldn't see Jesus and hear Jesus, so he got in a boat and he kind of pushed off a little bit off the shore, and people could sit down on this rocky kind of upward slope from the Sea of Galilee, and then the sea created this nice natural amphitheater for everybody to be able to hear. And if you show up, that's what Jesus wants for you today, is that you can hear. You don't have to wonder if Jesus is going to speak to you today. If you showed up to hear Jesus speak, Jesus will speak to you, and he always does that. So he he's teaching, and he teaches all day long, and he goes through some different things, and sometimes there's a conversation with just the disciples, and sometimes it's the people on shore. But Jesus teaches all day long, and that leads us up to where we kind of get to jump in the story today, and that's verse 35. Jesus has been teaching all day long and on the seashore in the boat to all these people. And it says, on that day, verse 35, when evening had come, he, being Jesus, told them, let's cross over to the other side of the lake. Now, the lake here is this large body of water that they call the Sea of Galilee. So if you're like, you said sea a minute ago, now you say lake, there's a discrepancy. It's not. Actually, it's the Sea of Galilee, which is an enormous lake in the area of Israel. So here we have Jesus, and he looks at his disciples, and he says, hey, I'm tired. I've been teaching all day long. I have an appointment. They don't know this yet. I'm going to go and cast some demons out of a guy in chapter 5, and I got to get to the other side. So, hey, let's cross over to the other side of the lake. And he just says that to them. And it says in 36, so they left the crowd. They left all those people on the shore. And it says, and they took him along since he was already in the boat. You ever read that and you thought, man, that's just such weird wording. Here's Jesus saying, hey, let's go to the other side. And then in the next verse, they're like, hey, they make it their idea, right? Like, hey, we're going to go to the other side. And Jesus, since you're already here, I guess you can go with us. I read the Bible and I see verses like that, and it's kind of comical to me, but we do the same thing, don't we? God has a plan for our life, and then somehow we make that our plan for our life, and we just kind of adapt it and take Jesus along since we're already kind of doing the thing. We don't let Jesus lead anymore. We decide we're going to lead, and we just kind of add him on to our life. And here's kind of what's happening in the story, and we get to see it plays out. Jesus has this idea that's so important. We're going to cross over to the other side of this lake or the sea, and somehow they've made it their idea, and Jesus just gets to go along because he's already in the boat. Very generous of them, very nice. They didn't kick him out and throw him out in the Sea of Galilee there, but they take him along to the other side since he's already in the boat. And it says there were other boats that were with him. There were other boats that were along. Now, these are like the hardcore fans of Jesus. Like, they came prepared that day. These guys apparently were Boy Scouts growing up, and they're like always prepared, and they know what's going on. And they brought their boats that day. So Jesus leaves, and these guys get in their boat, and they go after him. And this is kind of the scene that they're setting up on the Sea of Galilee. And it says in 37, a fierce windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking over the boat. So here's the scene. Jesus has been teaching all day long. He's teaching these people. He's getting tired, and he looks at the disciples, whoever's in the boat, and he's like, hey, we need to go to the other side of the lake. Somehow they make that their idea. Hey, we should go to the other side of the lake, and we'll just take Jesus with us. Here's these other people that are on other boats, and they're like, I want to see what Jesus is going to do on the other side of the lake. So everybody's out on the lake, and it's late in the evening, and they're sailing across the Sea of Galilee, which, by the way, is not like Douglas or Norris Lake, where you can throw a rock usually and hit the other side, but this great body of water with miles in between, where if you were in the middle, you probably weren't looking at either side of it. Like, here's this image, and here it is late at night, and they're out in the middle of this body of water, and all of a sudden it says this fierce windstorm arose, right? And no buildup, the thunder happened in the distance, and we could see the storm was coming, and 15 minutes later, 30 minutes later, we couldn't get anywhere. Like, all of a sudden, it goes from everything's okay to everything's crazy. This is the scenario that's being set up in the story. And you may look at that and you're like, well, that's a little crazy because you don't know much about the Sea of Galilee, and I don't know much about the Sea of Galilee, but luckily Google knows a lot about the Sea of Galilee. And storms on the Sea of Galilee are not an uncommon thing, right? Like, the Sea of Galilee is a body of water that sits 700 feet below sea level. So if you can imagine, like, here's sea level, dig a 700-foot hole. That's where the Sea of Galilee sits. It's down low. But around the Sea of Galilee, there's these slopes and this highlands. There's this hill country, and then kind of in the northeast area of that, there's this mountain. And this mountain is 9,000 feet above sea level. So you have a big difference, right, of about 9,700 feet. And the Sea of Galilee, because it sits down so low, is a very warm, kind of wet environment. And then you have this cool air up here on the mountain. And a lot of times what would happen is this cool air would come down the mountain, and it hit that warm air, and it would just all of a sudden spark these storms. It's not an unusual thing to be on the Sea of Galilee and to experience a storm. There's storms that happen on the Sea of Galilee. There's nothing miraculous this morning about the storm that happened on the Sea of Galilee. The amazing thing is even the fishermen, right, they would have been on the boat. They would have experienced these storms before. I think that's why you see it so calm at the beginning. Hey, there's a storm again. It happens on the Sea of Galilee, right? There are storms. If you go to the Sea of Galilee today, you will experience a storm if you're there long enough. Like, this is a thing that happens. And I'm not diminishing the size of the storm in the story. Apparently, it was a little bit of a crazy storm. I'm sure that there's some fluctuation in the degree of the storms on the Sea of Galilee. Like, not every storm is a crazy, I'm going to swamp your boat storm. But here's one of those storms. And it says, as soon as this thing started up, the waves started up. Here comes the fierce windstorm. In Matthew, it actually, the word used is like sea earthquake, like sea quake. So you can imagine kind of the image of what's happening as the waves come. And it says that it was already beginning to swamp the boat. Now, these boats were boats with low sides, so if the water got crazy, it would start coming in. And I don't know if you've ever been on a boat. I've not been on a boat many times, but I've been on a boat enough to know that the water is supposed to be outside of the boat, right? Like, boats are useful if the water is on the outside. But you're in trouble when the water starts to come on the inside. Right? Like, if water's coming inside the boat, there's an issue because eventually there will be so much water, the boat doesn't really matter anymore. Boats are great as long as the water is on the other side of it. And here these guys are, here the disciples are, and Jesus is, and this windstorm has arose, and the waves start crashing over the side of the boat, and the boat was already being swamped. Not like it's a little damp, but like we're filling up here. You get this image? And late in the night, we probably miles from land on either side. They didn't have street lights in big cities in this day, so maybe not even much light from these cities. If the boat goes under, you probably won't even know which direction to swim. Like, that's the story. And here comes the storm, and they've been through storms before, but here's another storm. And this storm maybe is a little worse than the other storms they've experienced, or maybe not. But either way, the boat starts filling up with water. Now, put yourself on the boat, right? Here comes the boat. You're in the boat. You're sitting there. Jesus is in the boat. Storm arises. Water starts filling up the boat. What are you thinking? Probably not, oh yeah, Jesus is here, so it's fine. Right? Like, the boat starts filling up with water. Maybe you're a fisherman and you've been around that before. Maybe you're not. Probably like some people in the boat were fishermen and some people were not. And maybe you've been through storms before, and maybe you've not. But either way, the boat starts filling up with water, and what's going on in your head if you're in the boat? This is not good, right? Like, this is not an ideal situation. And maybe if you're on the fisherman side of things, like some of these guys were, what you do is you jump into, I know how to do this mode, and you start taking down the sails. I don't know if that's something you do if in a storm, but I'm not a fisherman, so whatever. And then that didn't help, so you start taking the water in buckets and chucking it back over the side. And for a while, maybe you're like, man, I can do this. But the longer you do it and the more water is still in the boat, you eventually realize, maybe I can't do this. And you go to panic mode. Or maybe you're like me, who, if the boat's going down, I don't really know what to do except for look for a life jacket and pray. And you're just like, we're doomed. You're just watching it happen. And this is probably the scene that's going on in Mark chapter 4. You got your seasoned fishermen who are paling out water and taking down the sails and doing the thing because they've went through the storms before. And for a while they're good, and then they realize, I'm not really doing much. Because the more I pail, the more water is still in the boat. Or maybe you're like the tax collector who's like, I only know how to count money. And I don't know what to do with the boat that's going down. But either way, eventually we all get to the same spot, don't we? The boat's going down. We jump into panic mode because we've tried everything that we know how to do. We've pailed all the water and we've taken all the sails down. And maybe you know how to do a lot, and maybe you know how to do a little. Maybe you've been through a similar situation before and you kind of know the routine. Or maybe you've never been here before and you don't know what's going on. But either way, eventually we all get to a spot, just like these guys got to a spot of, I can't do this. And you start looking at that story and you start putting yourself into it, and it means a little different, doesn't it? See, the reality of it is today, even for us, we all go through storms, don't we? Life is hard. I'm going to be honest with you. If you've not been around life very long, life is hard. Maybe you've never went through anything hard. I've went through stuff hard. Bless you. I hope you never do. But I'm pretty sure you're going to. Maybe for all of us, we've come through situations that right now we're like, I don't really know how I got out of that. That was a crazy situation. And I went into panic mode, and I know exactly what this is like. And maybe for some of us today, we are in that situation where the boat's going down around us and it feels like life is just crumbling and I don't know what's going to happen and I could die. And that could look like a million things. For some of us, maybe we got some really bad news this week. For some of us, maybe home life's not going so great. For some of us, maybe we just struggle with ourselves and we feel like, I don't know if I can do this very much longer. And whether it's a physical storm today or a spiritual storm today, we all go through storms and we can relate. Now, I could take a poll across our rooms today and be like, anybody in a storm? And some of you would raise your hand. We don't need to do that. If I said, anybody been through a storm? Most of us would raise our hand, but we don't need to do that. The reality that we all can come to today is we know what it's like to struggle. We know what it's like to be in fear. We know what it's like to feel like everything's going to fall apart. I know what it's like, just like you know what it's like today, to think, I may not get out of this. Don't we? And we can act like all those feelings are from other people and this isn't for me, but in reality, I think all of us have been there. And if we're honest, maybe some of us today are there. And this is the situation they're in this storm. Maybe some of us today have tried everything we know how to do, and we're still in the storm. We're still in the battle today. We're still struggling today. And we can put ourselves right on the page. And this is the scenario in Mark chapter 4. Middle of the night, dark. Even if I can swim, I don't know which direction to swim. And if something doesn't happen, if something doesn't change fast, the boat's going down and I may not get out of this alive. They're paling water, they're throwing water, they're doing everything they know how to do to survive. And then imagine this. The boat's already being swamped, and it says in 38, but he was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. Now, the he's capitalized, so it doesn't take us long to figure out who the he is, right? The he is Jesus. Now, you can tell this is written by Peter, who was a fisherman, because he said the stern. And for most of us, we don't know what a stern is. It's the back of the boat. But can you imagine everything's falling apart around you? You feel like you could die. And then you look around to see Jesus is sleeping in the back of the boat. Waves crashing over. Jesus' sandals probably getting waterlogged. And he's just taking a nap in the back of the boat. Can you imagine that scenario? Maybe you can, because maybe you feel like you've been there. Maybe you feel like you are there. Everything's falling apart around me, and it feels like Jesus is asleep. Everything's crumbling around me, and it feels like God's taking a nap. Like he's left me, like he's forgotten me, like he doesn't care what I'm going through. Now imagine these guys on this boat, paling water, taking the sails down. Matthew's probably just running around, flailing his arms, hoping for the best. And then somebody looks over and they notice Jesus is sleeping in the back of the boat. Can you imagine the emotion that would come up out of that? Probably not, oh look, Jesus is sleeping, isn't that cute? So they wake him up. Probably in frustration, probably in disbelief, probably very aggravated because they're already very scared. And they look at Jesus, they wake him up and they say to him, "Teacher, don't you care that we are going to die?" Now this lets you know the situation that they're in. We've probably never been in a physical storm like this, but we can maybe relate to this question, this moment. Don't you care that we're going to die? Can't you see what's happening? Can't you see this storm? Can't you see what's going on around us? And you're sleeping. Don't you care? If we're honest, we've probably Maybe been in a moment where we've even asked God that before. Maybe some of us right now are asking God that, don't you care? Because it seems like whatever we're going through, whatever we went through, that God is nowhere to be found. We struggle and 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 we try everything we know how to do and we check all the plan. And maybe at the beginning we weren't freaking out, but now we're freaking out. And we got to this place where it feels like our world's crumbling, everything's falling apart around us, and we don't know what to do, and God is nowhere to be found. And what slips out in that moment in fear and anger and frustration is usually something like this: where are you at, God? Don't you see what's happening, and don't you care? Now, I know some of us maybe in our rooms today or even in this room today are a little bit too Christian to admit it, but I think most of us have had that honest conversation with God before. Where are you at? Because everything is falling apart, and it's supposed to be easy with you. It's supposed to be comfortable with you. It's supposed to always go well with you. I prayed that prayer, and nothing bad's ever supposed to happen to me. Where are you at? Don't you see what's happening, and don't you care? And this is the moment that these guys are in, because in that moment, what they feel like in the circumstances and the situation is, God, you've forgotten me. God, you've left me. God, you don't see me. God, you don't care. How would a loving God let me go through this? Don't you see what's happening, and don't you care? Maybe in our hearts this morning, we can just raise our hand and agree that we've been there. I'll be honest with you today because I feel like it's important. I've been there. Sometimes over crazy situations that, look at me, I'm still standing here from. And sometimes I just get caught up in myself and I ask these questions. But I've been there. And maybe today all you need to know is you're not alone. Maybe today all you need to know from the scripture today and from me today is here's some disciples of Jesus, some people that left everything to follow him, and they're feeling the same way that maybe you're feeling right now. And I'm not trying to diminish your storm, and I'm not trying to diminish that maybe you do feel abandoned and forgotten. I'm not trying to diminish that today. But I'm just saying today that maybe there's another option. They wake Jesus up, and I love what happens with Jesus because if you notice, Jesus doesn't immediately jump into freak out mode, does he? Isn't that crazy? Storm's going on, everything's nuts. You're like, Jesus, how did you not know this storm was going on? Don't you see what's happening? Don't you care? And he wakes up, and he doesn't just grab a pail and start throwing water over the side. He doesn't help take the sails down. He doesn't start running around screaming and flailing because he doesn't know what to do. He actually doesn't seem, if you read the story, bothered by the storm at all, does he? He doesn't seem to be in panic mode in the storm. Maybe what Jesus is doing in this story here is not just sleeping because he doesn't care. Maybe he's showing us that there is another option to the freak out today. There is another option other than fight or flight and panic mode. Maybe there is another option today. And Jesus here is sleeping in the back of the boat. And I'll be honest, if this storm is happening like this storm is happening, Jesus is either a really, really, really sound sleeper, or he noticed the storm, acknowledged the storm, and went back to sleep. You're like, well, why would he do that? Because Jesus is in a unique place where he understands and knows the Father. He knows the person of God. He knows that the Father is a loving Father who cares for us and wants what's best for us and who never leaves us or forsakes us. He knows the Father is watching over us. He knows the person of God. And he knows the plan of God. The plan of God for Jesus' life is not that he would be drowned in the middle of the Sea of Galilee on a boat. The plan was much greater, actually. He was going to go to a cross and die on a cross. He was going to have nails driven through his body, and he was going to wear a crown of thorns, and he was going to be beaten beyond the point of recognition. I don't really know which one is better, do you? I might take the boat over the cross. But he knew the plan of God, and the plan of God was not to allow Jesus to leave in this way. It was a different way. But he also knew the power of God. He knew that this storm, this mountain, this giant, whatever the thing is for you, is something that may be gigantic for you, but very small in the hands of God. And maybe the buckets couldn't do it, and taking the sails down couldn't do it. Maybe the boat couldn't even hold it. But the reality of it is, our God is a loving God. He knows the person of God. He knows the plan of God, that this is not how it ends. And he knows the power of God, that the storm is not a big deal to him. So he just pulls up a pillow, and he rests in the person and the plan and the power of God. When everything's falling apart, when everything looks crazy, when we feel like we're going to die, we have two options. We can say, God, where are you? Have you left me? Have you forgotten me? Or we can look beyond our circumstances and we can see that there is a God who never changes, and who is always loving, always forgiving, who has the character of love, who wants what's best for us, who has a plan for our life. And maybe this is it. Maybe we die in the storm, or maybe we don't. But either way, it's what God wants. And he has the power to do something about it. And Jesus just pulls up a pillow and he rests in the person, the plan, and the power of God. And I think if you look at this story, maybe what he's doing is he's inviting the disciples in the middle of this storm to pull up a pillow beside him, to leave the freak out and to rest in who God is and what he can do in our life. So Jesus is sleeping soundly in the back of the boat. They wake him up, and he does something amazing. Something uniquely Jesus, something that only he can do, and something you'll look like a fool if you ever try to do. It says he gets up, and he begins to rebuke the wind. This word's a word meaning that he fussed at the wind. He looks at the storm and he begins to fuss at it. I don't know exactly what he says in whole. Maybe he just said these few words. Maybe he said, hey, don't you know I'm trying to sleep here? I'm in here in the back of the boat and I'm trying to sleep, and you're making all this noise and tossing all these waves in, and I'm trying to sleep in this dry, comfortable place, and you're swamping the boat. You need to quit that foolishness right now. Maybe he said something like that. But can you imagine watching this happen? Here's Jesus. You wake him up and you're in freak out mode. You're in panic mode. And he just ignores all that. Don't you care that we're going to die? What a silly question. He doesn't even answer it. Don't you care we're about to be destroyed? He doesn't look back. Of course, honey, I care. He just ignores it because it's such a silly question. Yes, I care. I showed up because I care. And he just walks to the edge of the boat and he looks at this storm, this massive storm that nobody else on the boat can do anything about, and he starts to fuss at it. And the disciples probably are like, what is even happening right now? Why is he talking to the weather? Nobody talks to the weather. Nobody can even predict the weather. Why is he talking to the weather? And he's just fussing at this storm. And we don't know exactly what he says, but we do know he says something. He says, silence, be still. And I know in that moment he was talking to the storm, but I believe in that moment maybe he was also talking to them. And he walks over to the edge of the boat. He's like, hey, can you just quiet it down? Can you just stop all this? Silence, be still. And maybe today what you need in your life is for God to speak to your storm and to say that very same thing. But maybe what God is doing this morning is he's speaking to you and he's saying that very same thing. See, the reality today is Jesus does have the ability to stop every storm. There's no giant that's too big for him. There's no mountain that's too big for him. There's no miracle that's too big for him. He has the ability today to speak into every storm. Everything that's too big for us is really small to him. And He can speak to any of those things that are going on in our life, and He can tell them right now in this moment to stop. And maybe you've asked Him to do that over and over and over and over and over again. And here's a reality for us today. Maybe He hasn't. Because maybe He's doing something today that you and I can't see. We were never promised easy street, were we? It's not in there. We were never promised that nothing bad would ever happen. It's not in there. If that's the God you're looking for the wrong God. We were never promised that. We were never promised, say this prayer, come to church, put money in, read the Bible, say some prayers, and nothing bad will ever happen. We were actually promised the opposite of that in this life we would experience trials. We would experience storms. We would face giants. We would stand before mountains that are too big for us. And sometimes God chooses to stop the storm. But sometimes He invites us to stop. And maybe today, if you've been praying, God, stop this storm, stop this thing, make it shut down, make it go away, and He hasn't done it, maybe He's doing something different today than what you're praying for. I'm not saying to stop praying that He shuts down the storm, because maybe He will. He has all the power and all the ability, and I don't want to have not because I ask not. But maybe this morning what He's doing is bigger than what's happening outside the boat. He's doing something inside the boat. And maybe today He's trying to teach us when everything's falling apart, when everything's crumbling down around us, we don't have to freak out, but today we can trust in the person and the plan and the power of God. And we can pull up a pillow today and rest in who He is and what He's doing. So Jesus looks at the storm and He says, silence, be still. And this amazing thing happens. It says the wind ceased and there was a great calm. I love that word, a great calm. It's like a calmer calm. A calm like we've never seen before, right? Like I guarantee you that before they started out, there were some ripples and some waves. But in that word of God, He stopped a storm like it had never started before. There wasn't even a ripple in the sea. A silence we've never experienced before. He looks at it and He says, silence, be still. And there was a great calm. The power of God. We can trust in it. And it says the wind ceased, there was a great calm, and then He does this amazing thing in verse 40. He says to them, he turns away from the sea because that's taken care of. The storm is gone. And He speaks again, and he says to them, why are you fearful? It's a really great question at this point in the story. Do you still have no faith? And I think for a lot of us, we read this as a rebuke. Jesus rebuked the storm. He didn't rebuke the disciples. Let me just translate this for us today. What were you so scared of? Can you remind me why you were freaking out? Can you just tell me what was such a big deal? Can you reword to me why you were screaming and throwing your hands in the air, Matthew? Can you remind me, Peter, why you got 14 buckets out here? Can you take me through that again? Do you not see it yet? He asked them a question. Their question is, don't you care? And He looks right back and He says, don't you see? Don't you see it? Don't you see who I am? Don't you see what I can do? Don't you see the love that I have for you? Don't you see that I don't leave you and I don't forsake you? Don't you see that I don't walk away? Don't you see that in the face of every storm, every giant, every mountain, I'm bigger and I can work and I can move, that you can trust today in the power and the person and the plan of God. You can today rest in every situation, every circumstance. You can take up a pillow today when the world's falling apart around you and rest in the plan and the person and the power of God. Everything may be crumbling in your life today, and we can rest today in who He is. He doesn't leave us. He doesn't forsake us. He does love us. He does care for us, and we don't have to worry about that today. And He looks at him and He says, don't you get it? Don't you see it? You don't have to freak out today. In the middle of whatever you're going through, you can rest today in the power of God. I know it's out of your hands. I know you can't do anything to stop famine and nakedness and peril and danger of sword. I know you can't stop disease today. I know you can't stop all these things that are going on spiritually inside of you. I know you can't do anything about that today. I know you can't do anything about what's happening at home. I know you can't do anything about what's happening at work. I know you can't do anything about any of that. But today, when you can't, I can. And you can trust and you can rest in that truth. Man, that's the invitation today. Today that we have this ability to choose how we respond to the circumstances around us. The Bible talks about a peace that surpasses all understanding, right? When people would look at your life and they would say, hey, why aren't you freaking out? When people would look at what you're going through and say, hey, why are you not throwing your hands in the air and screaming right now? There is a God today who loves us and cares for us, who sent his son to die for us. And Romans 8 says this, if he wouldn't even spare his son, what now is he going to hold back? He already gave us the most precious thing in heaven. What's he holding back today? And today, we can ask the question, we can say, it's okay, you're in good company today. You can say, God, where are you? You can say today, God, what are you doing? You can say today, I don't see what's happening. You can say today, my whole life's falling apart and I don't know what you're doing and I don't know what your plan is and I need to see you work. You can say that. You can say, God, why don't you care? You can pray all those things. You're not a bad person for praying those things. You're in good company today, actually, if you pray those things. But I want you to listen after you say that to what God is going to say to you. You got to see it. Oh, yeah, I care. Can't you see that? The storm is not that big today. Can't you see that? What you're going through, it may be a giant thing for you today, but it's a very little thing in the hands of God today. You may have exhausted every possible resource today, but the resources of heaven are unlimited today. It may be a giant thing for you, but it's a very small thing for me. So don't be confused today when you're going through something crazy and God seems like he's sleeping. He's not worried about the outcome because he knows what's coming out of it. We can trust today. We can choose to trust today in the person, in the plan, and the power of God. And we can pull up a pillow and rest in who he is and what he's doing in our lives today. You may be in the craziest storm today. I'm not here to diminish that. You may be going through the fire today. I'm not here to diminish that. You may be, in fact, walking today through the valley of the shadow of death. I'm not diminishing that today. I'm not saying it's not a big deal. I'm not even saying I've experienced anything like it. But I am saying today that God is big enough. I am saying today that he has a plan. I am saying today that he loves you. You may not feel like it. You may feel left and alone, but you can't escape it today. There is a God who loves you. And there is a God who has all the power and the authority today. And maybe today, I'm not saying stop praying it. Jesus in the garden prayed, God, if there's any other way, let this cup pass from me. You pray it. You pray it until the answer is a definite no. But I want you to know today, the answer may in fact be, okay, silence be still to the storm. And it'll listen. But maybe the answer today will be, silence be still to us. God is moving and he's working today in your life. And he's doing something amazing. I believe that with everything in me. I believe he's doing that in all of us. In Romans 8, it says that he works all things together for the good of those that love him. Even the very worst moments of our life, God is working and weaving together for a good outcome because he loves us and he cares for us. And you maybe not feel like that in the storm, and I get that. But today, in spite of the circumstances, we can look beyond that and we can trust in the person and the power and the plan of God in our life. He's moving today. And today our response is not to work harder. Our response today is to surrender. The Word of God says to cast all our cares at His feet because He cares for us. So wherever we are this morning, I just want to give you a moment just to do that this morning, just to surrender to Him.